If you're like me, then you're curious how the ideologies that we know today have become so powerful and why we're still fighting about them. One of those ideologies, of course, is fascism. It is in my opinion, very broadly misunderstood ideology, not to say that it's one that should be replicated, just that I think that it is objectively misunderstood. In case you didn't know, it did not come from the Germans, from the Nazis. It actually came formally from the Italians. So in order to understand where this Italian ideology came from, you need to understand where Italy came from, the history of Italy, and which is why today I'm talking about the Concise History of Italy by Christopher Dugan or Christopher Duggan. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name in either of those, but it is, of course, not just Italy as we know it today. It hasn't always been the boot of Europe that we have come to know it as. It has, of course, had a variety of different forms and structures, governmentally, culturally, geographically. You get the picture. So, where did Italy come from? It started way back in 750 BC with the Roman Republic, or the Roman Kingdom, rather. Sorry for that misspeak. I am going to go way back to the very far back roots of Italy, of Rome, but I'm going to be very light on the details as starting far back. And as I come closer to the present, I'm going to add progressively more and more details. But this is a concise video about the concise history of Italy, so I'll have more links to resources and stuff down below in the description. Way back in 750 BC, though, you had the Roman kingdom. That lasted for about 250 years until it fell and changed into the Roman Republic, which that stood for about 500 years until 27 BC, where it formed into the Roman Empire. That thing that we call back to very often today, that we kind of look back with a romanticized view. It lasted until about 476 AD. Now, that old Roman identity, whether you look back to the kingdom, republic, empire, or just Rome in general, that is something that the Italians looked back on and called back to very passionately with not to say rose-colored glasses, but that was something that they used a lot to really tug at the identity of Italians as Romans. It collapsed for a variety of reasons. The Roman Empire did, not least of which was political corruption, a collapsing economy, just this general lack of connection and identity and belief, rather, loyalty to the civic identity of what it meant to be a Roman. And one of those things, additionally, was the privatization and the mercenaries being employed in the armies and their loyalties to the generals and the spoils of war that they could get, rather than the loyalty to the Roman Empire and the Roman identity. It was foreigners that made up their military. That was part of it, of course. That wasn't the one thing, but that was, of course, a piece of the picture. All that said, though, in 476, when the Roman Empire collapsed, it's not that the Romans suddenly collapsed. It's not that the people suddenly disappeared. It was a deeply fragmented people under various controls of states, warlords, of influences from militaries and politicians. It was just a fractured people. All of a sudden, the borders collapsed and new people moved in, and these people suddenly had new rulers. Pockets of Italy, of course, naturally, what I mean here is it still persisted. The identity never died, and the people still persisted. The Lombards, the Tuscans, the Piedmontese, Rome, Milan, Venice, Sardinia, Sicily, you still had these individual pockets of Italians that still believed, that still knew who they were, even if they did have these foreign influences coming in and ruling over them. This persisted, though, for a long, long time. In that time, though, you had this fractured land, this fractured people, and vastly disparate economic developments and industrial developments. In the north, you had roads that were developing, you had infrastructure that was building, cities that were forming. Silk and metalwork were very top tier and very valuable. It commanded a lot of power and respect and brought a lot of influence and money, particularly because of Milan and Venice. In the south, though, it remained largely agrarian. I'm not kidding. At one point, I think they had one road connecting northern Italy to southern Italy. So you had a lot of fractured countries and borders that were constantly shifting because of various peoples that were coming in and invading. And drastically different everything, as I've been hammering on at this point. These economic disparities will yield myriad problems and difficulties in due time. So more on that later, I guess. This lasted from that 5th century, that 476 AD, up until the 17th and 18th centuries. At least in my view, that's kind of where I put a pin on things starting to shift. The collective identity was starting to be realized. You had the Spanish Habsburgs, the Austrians, the Papal States, and the French all ruling various parts, and was basically these four main players having their hands in various parts of Italy. And the Italian people were finally getting sick and tired of being sick and tired. They were finally starting to have enough after all of these centuries of being ruled by foreign militaries and foreign governments. In the late 18th century, I think it was the 1790s, when Napoleon, and yes, I mean that Napoleon, was warring in Italy, he broke up enough regimes to plant the idea in the people of national identity and revolution. In 1815, though, this all fell and the old order was kind of reestablished, and people naturally hated it. They had a couple of decades of some semblance of national identity, of some semblance of cohesion, at least the idea of it. And then that in 1815 came crashing down, and you had foreign entities coming back. And yes, I understand French, Napoleon, but they were kind of friendly towards them. And I'll touch on that here in a moment. 1815, though, things reverted back to what it was just 20 years prior, and people hated it. In the 19th century, though, that 1815 to 1860s, I think, is when it started to actually be realized. You had four people that, I read this in the French version, so pardon me if you can't find it in the English if you look it up. And I wanted to study French, and I'm also kind of pretentious, I guess, so that's why I'm saying it's from the French. They became known as the fathers of the party. You had Giuseppe Mazzini, you had the Count of Cavour, you had Giuseppe Garibaldi, and King Victor Emmanuel II. Giuseppe Mazzini founded Young Italy to inspire the youth for liberty and unity under one national identity. This young fervor was eventually realized in a new king of Piedmont that managed to have these ideas be actualized governmentally. The Count of Cavour, I can't remember what his name actually was, but the Count of Cavour, he was a diplomat and an economist. He was very, very effective, very skilled and adept at negotiation and striking deals. But he was the guy that formed alliances and built infrastructure and industries throughout Italy in this same time. So you had Mazzini going around with the Young Italy group and building this young fervor for national identity, of the Count of Cavour, building up these things, making alliances, making inroads with other people, building up the opportunity for prosperity within the same people at that same time. Giuseppe Garibaldi was an expeditious revolutionary, and he went through and gathered people, usually, as I recall, vastly outnumbered and overpowered, and yet he still came out victorious most of the time, I'll say. But he went through, I think it was from north to south, toppling kingdoms that were basically in Italy's backyards. He was kicking out the foreigners, kicking out the invaders at this point. Again, all at the same time going on. And this kind of culminated whenever I can't remember which part of Italy he managed to recapture. I think it was the entirety of the south, the Kingdom of Sardinia, of the two Sicilies. And he came and met with King Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont in the north, and he basically just handed over everything that he won to King Victor Emmanuel, and that was him providing the crown. In 1861, it ended up being that he was Italy's first king, as proclaimed by the parliament, the king of a united Italy. Finally, in 1861, Italy was actually unified. Veneto fell in 1866 and Rome in 1870 when the French troops withdrew during the Franco-Prussian War. It was very messy, but eventually centuries of division yielded to one flag, one people appealing to a shared Roman heritage, Renaissance brilliance, and a desire for sovereignty. Notably, not religion though, mind you. The church fiercely opposed losing the papal states, but the people yielded to a secular, passionate nationalism, their Italian identity. Now, 1861, it's a unified country. They're unified governmentally and on paper, but that doesn't mean much in effect and in actual practice. The new kingdom was in some ways worse off than before. You still had the industrialized north, at this point centered in Milan because of their textiles and silk. And in the south, the agrarian south, the Mezzogiorno as they called themselves, it was basically another world. You had vast estates, you had, you had primitive farming, you had dirt poor infrastructure, and naturally a lot of poverty that came with this. You had a lot of brigands and bandits roving the south. It was frankly just bad. Culturally as well, though, you had a communal, more progressive northern culture in the cities, and in the south, where it was more agrarian, they were very independent and gritty and kind of just Republican in the governmental sense. So you had these economic differences, you had these cultural differences, infrastructural differences. Neither region, though, built up manufacturing really much at all, and that led to another set of problems in just another few decades for them in both world wars, unfortunately. They didn't really have coal, they didn't have iron, they had a very weak, heavy industry, which all of this and a number of other reasons bred inefficiency throughout the whole thing. It was, again, frankly, just bad. So they weren't able to generate a lot of power at home. As much as they were trying, as much as the forefathers of the party, the founders of the party, worked through Young Italy and all that to build all this stuff up, it didn't produce the oomph that they were really going for, especially whenever Italy started seeking to project power abroad. They were having all of this trouble at home. They didn't really have much of an industry or manufacturing base, and yet they still decided in the 1890s to go and colonize Ethiopia. Why? To kind of make a name for themselves, to kind of exert that power and kind of realize that aspect of the old Rome. But that was not the time to do it, and it showed whenever they ended up getting booted out of Ethiopia. Now, in today, the modern world, we might still look at a modern Western nation going to someplace in Central Africa and getting booted back out from whence they came and be like, wow, you guys couldn't take care of those guys. It was kind of the same thing back then, only much more so. It was kind of the effect of it, the shame in that was kind of magnified for them because they were realizing their national identity and coming together back under one kingdom, much like the Romans started off as, and they wanted to kind of replicate that already. And the very first time they tried it, they basically failed. This kind of continued, though, in 1915 when Italy joined World War I on our side under the, not guise, but under the agreement of land promises if they were to contribute effectively. Now, for a variety of reasons, again, links below for further context and research that I've done, videos and books and whatnot, they didn't get what they felt they deserved. It's not necessarily that they were gypped, but they didn't get everything that they thought they were going to get for participating in World War I the way that they did. They ended up calling it the mutilated victory, and it did not help them at all with their national pride, with their industrial base that was going on. Like, they were already hurting at home, they were hurting abroad. They felt like they kept getting, punched down from the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. They were not happy. And at this point, in 1915 and in World War I, Benito Mussolini was already working within Italy. He was already, I think at this point, he was working at the Avanti, the socialist newspaper, before he went and made his Popolo d'Italia, his own fascist newspaper. But he was absolutely working. He served in World War I. The Bersaglieri, it was something of a specialized unit. He really served in World War I, but outside of the war, he was a journalist. I'm getting ahead of myself, though, with fascism in Italy, though. In that time, though, before Benito Mussolini actually came to power and was actually the dictator of Italy, there was still this post-war, kind of not collapse, but this post-war really severe hardship in Italy after World War I, and this was made worse by the socialists in Italy, the way that they were striking, the way that they were further hurting and hampering the economy, the way that they were creating cultural, I can't think of the opposite of cohesion, but discohesion. they were dissolving they were attacking rather the Italian identity and the national identity, because they made it based on class. It was a socialist, it was a communist endeavor that they had, and that was deeply and personally offensive to the nationalist and to the fascist ideas and movements in Italy. That aside, though, even though they were, again, still under one banner, still under one flag with one government, you still had this lack of industrialization, this kind of stagnant economy. This really hurt pride. And what this did was it created a fragile state that was really truly ripe for strongman politics. Italians then, and to some degree, maybe they still do, but at least Italians then craved order, they craved greatness, and they wanted a sort of revenge on the humiliations of history, both distant and immediate history. These same inefficiencies that had been affecting them for hundreds of years, if not centuries at that point, that they just saw realized in their expedition into Ethiopia and their time in World War I, would naturally come back to haunt them in World War II. This same ineffective manufacturing base, their inability to kind of adapt armor and weaponry to actually make a formidable air force or anything really, and their kind of tepidness in military engagements, as I found in history, led them to be a particularly ineffective military. And it's almost as though they had no business being in World War II, being at least promising the roles that they could have, promising themselves, promising their country to the roles that they did, because they just didn't have the base for that. But again, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. All of that is my concise video about the concise history of Italy. And I think it makes total sense how, after those centuries of greatness and strength and power and flourishing and civic identity of the Romans, those centuries of fractured identity and discohesion, of disunity among the Italians, and then that century, maybe century and a half, that's about a century of, yeah, we can do this, and they're coming together and they built that base. They were calling back to that Roman greatness. They were calling back to the greatness of the Renaissance, and they were appealing to a, I think, natural desire for sovereignty under that unique Italian identity. I think it makes total sense how that made room for the fascist movement, at the very least, a deeply nationalist movement, but also, unfortunately, taking a step further in the wrong direction, the fascist movement. But if you like that, if you like my rants and rambles, I do the algorithm stuff, but if you really want to support me, I have links down below for books that I write. I write education and nonfiction, and I'm working on my first novel too. Again, do the algorithm stuff, but if you agree with me, really leave a comment. If you disagree with me, also please really leave a comment. I'm here to discuss. I think we need to have more of these discussions, and people just need to know more, myself included. So thank you, especially if you made it this far, and I hope I'll see you in the next one.